In the rolling hills of ancient Phrygia, where thermal springs steamed beneath violet skies, and the earth held the memory of empires long dissolved, a child was born into bondage. No one recorded the exact day, no monument marked the place, and no celebration greeted his arrival. He would come to be called Epictetus, a name that simply meant acquired or purchased, as though a person could be summed up by the transaction that brought them into a household. And yet this boy, who owned nothing in the world, not even his own body, would one day teach the most powerful people in Rome that true freedom lies entirely within the mind. The province of Phrygia lay in the heart of Anatolia, a land of ancient mountains and sweeping plateaus, where the earth itself seemed to breathe. Underground rivers of geothermally heated water pushed through fissures in the limestone, surfacing as steaming cascades that had drawn visitors for centuries before any Roman ever set foot there. The air carried the faint scent of sulfur and wild thyme, mingling with the mineral richness of stone that had been forming and reforming since long before human memory. It was in this landscape, sometime around the year 50 of the Common Era, that a boy was born who would one day reshape the way generations thought about freedom, suffering, and the nature of the human mind. The boy was born into slavery, which in the ancient world was not an unusual circumstance. Slavery was the fabric upon which much of the Roman economy was woven, and millions of people lived their entire lives as the property of others. Some had been captured in war, others had fallen into debt, and still others were born into the condition as he was, inheriting bondage from their mothers as naturally as they inherited the color of their eyes. His mother's name has not survived, nor has his father's, and this absence of origin is itself telling. The enslaved were not considered worthy of record in the way free citizens were. Their births went unnoted by historians, their deaths unmarked by inscriptions. They existed in the margins of every grand historical account, present everywhere and acknowledged almost nowhere. The name Epictetus was not a name his parents gave him. It was a Greek word meaning acquired or gained, a term typically used for property that had been purchased. To name a person this way was to declare, from the very outset, that they were an object, a possession, something that had been acquired, rather than someone who had been born. And yet there is a strange power in this naming, because the word itself would come to carry an irony so profound that later generations would marvel at it. The man who was called acquired would become the greatest teacher of what cannot be taken away. The boy who was named as property would demonstrate that the only things truly worth having are those no transaction can transfer and no force can remove. He spent his earliest years in or near Hierapolis, a city famous even then for its remarkable thermal springs. The white travertine terraces that formed around the hot springs created otherworldly landscapes, cascading basins of mineral-rich water that steamed in the cool morning air and glowed pink and gold in the light of the setting sun. The city sat upon a plateau overlooking the broad valley of the Meander River, and from its heights you could see for miles across the Anatolian countryside. It was a place of pilgrimage and healing, where people came to bathe in the warm waters and seek relief from ailments of the body. The air around the springs was perpetually misty, carrying the mineral tang of calcium and sulfur, and the ground beneath was warm to the touch, even where no water flowed. For a child born into slavery, the springs may have been one of the few landscapes of wonder available to him. The pools were public, or at least accessible to servants and slaves who accompanied their masters, and the sight of all that steaming water cascading over white stone must have left an impression on a mind that would later prize clarity and simplicity above all things. There is something in the image of those thermal terraces, with their clean lines and their elemental contrast of hot water and cool stone, that anticipates the philosophy Epictetus would eventually teach, a philosophy built on the clear distinction between what is within our power and what is not, between the hot core of our own volition and the cool stone of external circumstance that we can never truly possess. The boy would have known the sound of the water before he understood anything else about the world. The low, constant murmur of the thermal springs rising from deep within the earth would have been among the first sounds he heard, a sound so steady and so ancient that it seemed to belong not to any particular moment, but to the earth itself. The mineral terraces gleamed white and cream in the early morning light, and steam drifted across them like the breath of some vast and sleeping creature beneath the ground. To stand beside those pools as a child, feeling the warmth rising through the soles of bare feet, watching the water cascade over stone in endless and unhurried repetition, was to be initiated into a kind of patience that had nothing to do with human will. The springs did not hurry, and the stone did not crack, and the steam did not argue with the wind that moved it. Everything simply was, and in that simple being there lay a lesson the boy would spend the rest of his life learning to articulate in the language of philosophy, rather than the language of water and stone. We know almost nothing about his earliest childhood. We do not know whether he was raised by his mother or separated from her, as slave children often were, to be trained for service. We do not know whether he had siblings, or whether he played in the streets of Hierapolis, or whether he was taken from Phrygia as an infant. The silence of the historical record on these points is itself a kind of testimony to the condition of slavery, which rendered a person's inner life invisible to the world that claimed ownership of their body. Whatever tenderness or suffering marked his first years, it passed unrecorded, as the early lives of most enslaved people did. What we can say with some confidence is that the landscape of Phrygia shaped him in ways that would endure throughout his life. The broad skies, the mineral earth, the thermal waters that emerged from deep below the ground, all of these elements would find their way into his teaching. He would speak often of nature as a guide and a teacher, of the rational order that underlies the apparent chaos of the world, and of the importance of aligning oneself with the way things are rather than struggling against forces beyond one's control. These ideas have the feel of a person who grew up in close proximity to natural forces that were vast, ancient, and utterly indifferent to human wishes, and who learned from that proximity not despair, but a kind of hard-won acceptance and even gratitude. There is reason to believe that the child possessed an unusual capacity for observation and reflection, even before any formal teaching reached him. Children who grow up in conditions of hardship often develop a watchfulness that more sheltered children never acquire, a habit of paying close attention to the moods and movements of the adults around them, of reading the atmosphere of a room before entering it, of sensing when danger is near and when it has passed. This watchfulness, born of necessity, is not so different from the philosophical attentiveness that Epictetus would later teach his students to cultivate. The same faculty that allowed a slave child to navigate the perils of a household where his survival depended on reading the intentions of others would, in time, become the faculty that allowed him to examine the impressions of his own mind with equal care and precision. The eyes that learned to watch the world learned also to watch the self, and in that doubling of attention lies the beginning of all philosophical practice. At some point in his childhood or early adolescence, the boy was taken from Phrygia and brought to Rome. The journey would have been long and arduous, traveling overland through Anatolia and across the Aegean Sea, or perhaps by ship from one of the ports on the southern coast. He would have seen landscapes he had never imagined, mountains higher than any in Phrygia, seas wider than any inland body of water, and cities larger and more crowded than Hierapolis. And he would have arrived in Rome as property, a piece of acquired merchandise to be delivered to his new owner. The city that greeted him was the largest and most powerful in the Western world, a metropolis of perhaps 1 million people, a place of marble temples and squalid tenements, of senatorial debates and gladiatorial blood, of extraordinary wealth and desperate poverty existing side by side in a density that must have overwhelmed a boy from the Phrygian hills. The man who purchased or received the boy from Phrygia was named Epictetus, and he was one of the most powerful freedmen in Rome. Epictetus had once been a slave himself, but he had been freed by the Emperor Nero and had risen through a combination of administrative talent, political cunning, and personal loyalty to become Nero's secretary, a position of extraordinary influence. He managed the emperor's correspondence, controlled access to his person, and handled sensitive matters of state that others were never permitted to see. In the complex hierarchy of the Roman imperial court, where formal rank often mattered less than proximity to power, Epictetus stood very near the center. He was wealthy, cultured, and well-connected. His household on the Esquiline Hill was one of considerable refinement, filled with Greek artworks, fine pottery, and the trappings of a man who had ascended from nothing to the highest circles of Roman society. He collected books and employed scribes. He hosted dinner parties attended by senators and intellectuals, and he moved through the city with the confidence of a person who had survived the most dangerous political environment in the ancient world and emerged not only alive but prosperous. And in this household, among the many slaves who cooked and cleaned and served and carried messages, was the boy from Phrygia, the child who would be called Epictetus. Life as a slave in a wealthy Roman household was a complex and contradictory existence. On the one hand, the material conditions were often better than those of the free poor, who struggled daily for food and shelter. A slave in the household of someone like Epictetus would have had regular meals, a place to sleep, clothing, and a degree of physical security that a day laborer in the streets of Rome could not count on. On the other hand, the slave's entire existence was subject to the will of another person. They could be sold at any moment, separated from family and friends, punished with impunity, or even killed, because under Roman law a slave was not a person but a thing, a piece of property with no legal rights and no protection against the cruelty or caprice of an owner. The daily routine of the household would have been governed by a strict rhythm of service. Slaves rose before dawn to prepare the morning meal. They attended to their master's needs throughout the day. They served at banquets that might last far into the night. And they were always on call, always available, their time and labor belonging entirely to someone else. For a boy of sharp intelligence and sensitive temperament, as Epictetus appears to have been, this existence must have been both enraging and instructive. Enraging because every instinct toward autonomy, toward self-direction, toward the simple dignity of choosing one's own actions, was frustrated by the absolute authority of another, and instructive because this very frustration would force upon him a question that most people, including many who considered themselves free, never truly confront. What does it mean to be free when you cannot control the circumstances of your life? The physical spaces of the household itself reinforced this lesson at every turn. The grand atrium with its marble columns and painted walls belonged to Epictetus, and the boy moved through it only to serve. The gardens with their fountains and statuary were places of beauty that he could tend but never truly enjoy as his own. The library, if he was permitted to enter it, was a room filled with knowledge that was not meant for him, scrolls he could dust and organize, but was not expected to read. Even the food that was prepared in the kitchen, the rich Mediterranean dishes of honey and figs and olive oil and roasted meats, was prepared by slaves but served first to the master and his guests, with the leftovers distributed to those who had done the cooking. Every sensory experience of the household, the smell of spiced wine, the sound of laughter from the dining room, the feel of fine cloth that he was forbidden to wear, reminded him that he existed in a world of abundance from which he was permanently excluded, not by any fault of his own, but by the accident of his birth. The Rome in which Epictetus grew up was the Rome of Nero, and this was not a safe place for anyone, let alone a slave, with no protectors and no recourse. Nero's reign was marked by extravagance, paranoia, and periodic outbursts of spectacular cruelty. The Great Fire that consumed much of Rome in the year 64 was blamed on the Christians, who were persecuted with a savagery that shocked even Roman sensibilities. Nero's artistic pretensions, his performances on stage, and his participation in chariot races offended traditional Roman values and alienated the senatorial class. Conspiracies formed and were discovered, and those implicated were put to death with a terrible thoroughness that even Roman sensibilities found disturbing. The atmosphere in the city during these years was one of underlying tension, a sense that anything could happen, that fortunes could reverse in a single day, and that no one, however powerful, was truly secure. For the slaves of Epictetus's household, the political intrigues of the imperial court were not abstract events reported by historians. They were lived experiences that affected their daily existence. When Epictetus was anxious, the household felt it. When he received troubling news, the tension rippled outward through the servants and attendants who depended on his stability for their own. And when the political winds shifted, as they did with increasing frequency as Nero's reign deteriorated, the consequences could be dire for everyone connected to the emperor's inner circle. In this environment, the young Epictetus would have learned early that external circumstances are unpredictable, that the fortunes of the powerful can collapse without warning, and that the only reliable source of stability in an unstable world is something internal, something that no political upheaval can destroy. It is worth pausing to consider what it would have meant to be a thinking, feeling person in the condition of slavery. Every day brought reminders of one's status, reminders that were not merely theoretical but physical and immediate. There was the collar that some slaves wore, inscribed with the name of their owner, and a warning to anyone who might encounter them that they were fugitive property. There was the fact that one could not legally marry, could not own property, could not testify in court, could not refuse any command, no matter how degrading or dangerous. There was the constant awareness that at any moment one might be sold, sent away, punished, or simply disposed of, and that no one in the wider society would regard this as an injustice. To live with this awareness and yet maintain one's dignity, one's sense of personhood, one's capacity for reason and reflection, required a kind of inner strength that most people are never called upon to develop. And yet this is precisely what the young Epictetus was developing, though he may not have recognized it as such at the time. The very conditions that were designed to break him, to reduce him to a tool for another's use, were forcing him to cultivate the inner resources that would later make him one of the most important philosophers in the Western tradition. There were other slaves in the household who broke under the pressure, who became sullen or desperate or simply numb, who surrendered the last remnants of their autonomy in exchange for the small mercies of compliance. Epictetus chose a different path, not because he was stronger or braver than the others, but because he had encountered a framework of thought that showed him another possibility, a way of being in the world that did not depend on external freedom to achieve inner dignity. The frustration of his will by external force was teaching him, in the hardest possible school, the lesson that would become the cornerstone of his entire philosophy, that the only thing truly within our power is our own response to what happens to us, and that this response, this inner movement of the mind, is the only thing that matters for our well-being. The household of Epictetus was not without its intellectual opportunities. The secretary to the emperor was a man of considerable learning who maintained a library and hosted conversations with philosophers and scholars. As a slave with administrative duties, the young Epictetus would have been present in rooms where ideas were discussed, where books were read aloud, and where the great questions of philosophy, ethics, and the nature of the good life were debated with the passion and rigor that characterized Roman intellectual life. These experiences must have stirred something in him, some recognition that the world of thought offered a kind of freedom that no chains could confine and no master could take away. The experience of listening from the margins, of absorbing ideas that were not addressed to him and were never intended for his ears, may have shaped his understanding in ways that a more formal education would not have. There is a particular kind of attention that develops in people who are accustomed to being overlooked, an ability to listen deeply and to notice what others miss, because they have learned that their survival depends on reading situations accurately. The boy who stood silently in the corners of Epictetus's library, polishing bronze while philosophers debated the nature of the good life, was not merely a passive observer. He was gathering, fragment by fragment, a vision of human possibility that would eventually become the most powerful force in his existence. A vision that told him the mind, he had been told was worthless was in fact the only thing that truly mattered. Sometime during his years in the household of Epaphroditus, the young Epictetus encountered the teaching of Musonius Rufus, and this encounter changed the entire course of his life. Musonius was the most respected Stoic philosopher of his generation, a man of such personal integrity that even those who disagreed with his philosophy regarded him with admiration. He had been exiled by Nero for opposing the emperor's excesses, and he had returned after Nero's death to continue teaching with the same quiet fearlessness that had gotten him banished in the first place. He taught not in a formal academy, but in the gardens and public spaces of Rome, welcoming anyone who wished to listen, and this openness made his lectures accessible even to slaves, who were normally excluded from the formal institutions of education. It is not entirely clear how Epictetus first came to hear Musonius speak. He may have been sent on an errand to deliver something to a gathering where Musonius was lecturing, or he may have been allowed, perhaps even encouraged, to attend by Epaphroditus, who was himself interested in philosophy and who may have recognized the boy's intelligence. What is clear is that once Epictetus heard the lectures, something within him responded with a force and clarity that would define the rest of his life. The ideas that Musonius presented were not merely interesting to him, they were revelatory. They articulated, in precise and rational terms, a truth that Epictetus had been feeling his way toward through years of quiet observation and suppressed reflection, that the condition of one's soul matters more than the condition of one's body, and that no external circumstance, not even slavery, can prevent a person from living a life of virtue and wisdom. Musonius Rufus was a philosopher of unusual practicality and moral courage. Unlike some Stoic thinkers who ranged broadly across questions of logic, physics, and metaphysics, Musonius focused with remarkable intensity on ethics, and within ethics on the question of how to live well in the actual conditions of human existence. He argued that philosophy was not an abstract discipline to be studied in isolation from life, but a daily practice, a set of tools for navigating the specific challenges that each person faces. He taught that everyone, regardless of their social status, was capable of philosophizing, and that virtue was not the exclusive property of the educated elite. Women, he insisted, could study philosophy just as well as men, a radical position in the Roman world, and slaves were just as capable of wisdom as free citizens. These ideas would have struck Epictetus with the force of recognition, because they affirmed something he must have felt in the deepest part of himself, that his mind, his capacity for thought and understanding, was not diminished by his legal status. The lectures of Musonius covered a wide range of practical topics. He spoke about food and the simple diet that philosophy recommends, arguing that overindulgence in eating weakens both body and soul. He discussed the proper relationship between men and women, arguing for a partnership of equals grounded in mutual respect. He addressed the question of whether a wise person would ever participate in politics, and he argued that the wise person would engage in public life when circumstances permitted, but would never sacrifice principle for position. He talked about anger, about grief, about fear, about the training of the mind to remain calm and rational in the face of provocation and misfortune. And in all of these discussions, there ran a single thread, a constant emphasis on the idea that our judgments, not our circumstances, determine our experience of life. The setting of these lectures would have imprinted itself on Epictetus's memory with particular vividness. Roman gardens in the afternoon were places of dappled light and murmuring water, where the shade of plane trees and the scent of rosemary and myrtle created an atmosphere that was at once stimulating and calm. The students would have sat on stone benches or on the grass, their robes draped loosely in the warmth, while Musonius stood or walked among them, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had suffered for his beliefs and emerged unbroken. For a slave who had spent his days in the enclosed and hierarchical spaces of a Roman household, these open, air gatherings must have felt like a different world entirely, a world where the air moved freely and ideas were exchanged without regard for the social positions of the people who held them. The physical openness of the garden mirrored the intellectual openness of the teaching, and both would have reinforced Epictetus's growing conviction that truth does not recognize the boundaries that human societies erect between people. For Epictetus, attending these lectures must have been like finding water in a desert. Here was a man of great learning and reputation saying, in the most public and unambiguous terms, that the things Epictetus had been forced to accept about the external limits of his life were true, and that they did not matter. His body might be enslaved, but his mind was free. His social standing might be at the bottom of the Roman hierarchy, but his capacity for virtue placed him on exactly the same moral level as the greatest senator or the emperor himself. This was not comfort or consolation in the ordinary sense. It was something far more powerful. It was a framework for understanding his experience that did not require him to deny or minimize the injustice of his condition, but instead showed him a dimension of freedom that no external force could touch. The young slave would have attended these lectures whenever he could, slipping away from his duties, or perhaps being permitted to go by a master who, whatever his other failings, was not hostile to philosophical inquiry. He would have listened with an intensity that his fellow listeners, many of them wealthy and well educated, could scarcely have matched, because for them philosophy was an intellectual pursuit, an adornment of a life already comfortable and secure, while for Epictetus it was a matter of survival, a way of preserving his humanity in a world that denied it to him. This difference in urgency gave his understanding a depth and a practical edge that even Musonius must have noticed and respected. There were risks in this devotion. A slave who spent his time on philosophy was a slave who was neglecting the duties his master expected of him. There was always the danger that Epaphroditus, or one of his overseers, would discover where Epictetus was going and would forbid him to attend, or worse, would punish him for what they might regard as an improper interest above his station. But the pull of the teaching was too strong to resist. The ideas that Musonius presented were not just interesting, they were, for Epictetus, the key to understanding his own experience. Every lecture confirmed what he had felt in some inarticulate way since childhood, that the mind's freedom is deeper than any chain, and that the person who masters their own judgments is richer than any emperor who merely commands armies. And between the lectures, in the long intervals when Epictetus was back in the household performing the tasks required of him, the ideas would have continued to work on his mind like water seeping through stone. He would have found himself interpreting the events of the household through the framework Musonius had given him. A punishment from an overseer was no longer merely an instance of cruelty. It was an opportunity to practice the discipline of not assenting to the impression that suffering had been done to him. A rebuke or an insult was no longer a wound to his dignity. It was a test of whether his sense of self-worth truly depended on things within his control. The philosophy was not something he turned on when he entered the garden and turned off when he returned to the household. It was becoming the lens through which he saw everything, the continuous and unbroken practice of a mind that was learning to be free even while the body remained enslaved. The relationship between teacher and student deepened over time. Musonius was known for his personal attention to those who showed genuine commitment, and Epictetus's commitment was beyond question. He asked questions that revealed a mind already practicing the discipline of philosophy, not merely learning its content. He challenged assumptions with a quiet persistence that spoke of long hours of private reflection, and he applied the teachings to his own life with a rigor that went far beyond what was required or expected of any student. Where others might have nodded at the idea that externals do not determine our happiness and then gone on with their comfortable lives, Epictetus actually lived as though it were true, because he had no choice. He could not escape his enslavement through any external means, so he had to find freedom within. And this necessity became the forge in which his philosophy was hammered into something harder and more durable than the teachings of any classroom. The years of study under Musonius gave Epictetus something that no Roman citizen could take from him, and no amount of suffering could diminish: a systematic understanding of the nature of human freedom. He learned to distinguish between things that are up to us, our judgments, our desires, our aversions, our mental attitudes, and things that are not up to us, our bodies, our possessions, our reputations, our social standing, and the events that befall us through no choice of our own. This distinction, which would become the central pillar of his own teaching, was not new with Epictetus. It was rooted in the earlier Stoic tradition, and Musonius had emphasized it repeatedly. But Epictetus received it with a clarity and an urgency that transformed it from a philosophical abstraction into a lived reality, a daily practice of the mind that would sustain him through everything that followed. There came a day in the life of Epictetus when the philosophy he had been studying was put to its most severe test. According to the ancient accounts, Epictetus, for reasons that are not entirely clear, subjected Epictetus to a punishment that left him with a permanent injury to his leg. Some sources say that Epictetus twisted or wrenched the leg with his own hands, perhaps in a moment of anger or frustration. Others suggest a more deliberate and systematic cruelty. Whatever the precise nature of the act, the result was that the leg was damaged in a way that never fully healed, leaving Epictetus with a limp that would remain with him for the rest of his life. This event is one of the most significant moments in the story of Epictetus, not because of the suffering it caused, but because of what it revealed about the philosophy he had been cultivating. Here was an experience of physical pain and permanent bodily damage inflicted by another person against his will, an experience that embodied in the most concrete possible way the condition of slavery itself. His own body, the most immediate and intimate thing he possessed, had been violated by the will of his master. There could hardly be a more visceral illustration of the gap between what is up to us and what is not. The health of his leg was not up to him. The actions of Epictetus were not up to him. The pain he felt was not up to him, at least not in its immediate physical dimension. And yet, according to the accounts that have come down to us, Epictetus met this suffering with a calm that astonished those who witnessed it. He did not cry out in rage or despair. He did not beg for mercy or revenge. He did not curse the injustice of his condition or the cruelty of his master. Instead, he is reported to have said, when he saw what was being done to him and realized the permanence of the damage, that Epictetus could break his leg, but could not break his will. The body, he seemed to be saying, is a thing that can be harmed, that can be damaged, that can be taken from us entirely. And none of this touches the true self, the rational faculty that judges and chooses and responds to the world. This was not denial of pain. He felt the pain as acutely as any person would. It was a radical reframing of what pain means, a refusal to allow the suffering of the body to become the suffering of the soul. The pain itself must have been extraordinary, a deep and throbbing ache that radiated from the damaged bone and muscle, intensifying with every movement, settling into a persistent dull fire that made sleep difficult and standing an act of will. The room where he lay would have been dim and close, lit by a single oil lamp that cast shifting shadows on the stone walls, the air heavy with the smell of herbal compresses and the copper tang of dried blood in the bandages. Other slaves would have come to tend him, changing the dressings, bringing water, perhaps whispering among themselves about what had happened and what it might mean for all of them. And in that dim room, surrounded by the quiet concern of fellow sufferers, Epictetus would have turned his attention inward, examining the pain not as an enemy to be fought, but as a sensation to be observed, a fact of the body to be acknowledged without being allowed to commandeer the mind. This was the philosophy in its most demanding application, and he applied it not with the ease of long practice, but with the desperate determination of a person who understood that his survival as a thinking, feeling being depended on it. The days and weeks that followed must have been difficult in the extreme. A damaged leg in the ancient world was a far more serious matter than it would be today. There were no surgical interventions, no pain medications beyond herbal remedies, no physical therapy, no prosthetic devices. The leg would have healed, or partially healed, on its own, and Epictetus would have had to learn to move through the world with a body that no longer functioned as it once had. The simplest tasks, walking, standing, carrying loads, would have become harder and more painful. For a slave whose economic value was partly determined by physical capability, a permanent injury was not merely a personal tragedy, but a potential threat to one's already precarious position. But it was during this period of recovery and adjustment that the philosophy of Epictetus crystallized into its final and most powerful form. The broken leg became, in his thinking, the perfect metaphor for the human condition. We are all, he would later teach, like people with injured limbs. We all carry wounds that we did not choose and cannot erase. We are all subject to forces beyond our control that can damage us physically, socially, emotionally, and materially. And the question is not whether these wounds will come, because they will, but how we respond to them when they do. The leg was broken. That was a fact, an external event, not up to Epictetus. but whether he would spend the rest of his life in bitterness and rage, or whether he would accept the injury and direct his attention to what remained within his power, that was entirely up to him. There is a gentleness in the way the later accounts describe Epictetus's response to his injury that is worth noting. He did not celebrate the pain or pretend that it was anything other than what it was. He did not adopt a posture of heroic stoicism that denied the reality of suffering. Instead, he seems to have approached his injury with a kind of quiet compassion, both for himself and for the human condition that all people share. We are fragile creatures, he seemed to be saying, vulnerable to harm from 1,000 different directions, and the beginning of wisdom is to accept this fragility without either exaggerating it or pretending it does not exist. The body can be broken, that is its nature, but the mind, the rational faculty that examines and judges and chooses, that cannot be broken by any external force, and this is the foundation upon which a life of genuine freedom can be built. During those long weeks of recovery, when the only activity available to him was thought itself, Epictetus would have had ample time to examine the nature of the choice that lay before him. The path of bitterness was the natural one, the one that any reasonable person in his position would be expected to follow. He had been wronged. His body had been permanently damaged by a person who had no right to do what he did. The injustice of it was absolute and undeniable. But the question Epictetus posed to himself, the question that his philosophy compelled him to ask, was not whether the injustice was real, but whether dwelling on it would serve any purpose other than to compound his suffering. The leg was already broken. That fact could not be changed by rage or grief or the most eloquent denunciation of Epaphroditus's cruelty. What could be changed was the state of his own mind, and it was this change, this deliberate and disciplined turning of attention away from what could not be remedied and toward what could, that would transform his suffering from a mere catastrophe into something that had meaning and purpose and direction. The image of Epictetus limping through the streets of Rome, or later through the colonnades of Nicopolis, his body marked by the cruelty of another person, but his bearing calm and dignified, is one of the most powerful images in the history of philosophy. It is a living demonstration of the ideas he taught, proof that the philosophy was not mere theory, but a practical response to the hardest realities of human existence. And it is this combination, the profundity of the ideas and the concreteness of the life in which they were tested, that has made Epictetus one of the most compelling and relatable of all ancient philosophers. He did not teach from a position of comfort or privilege. He taught from a position of suffering, and his teaching was validated not by logical argument alone, but by the example of a life lived in accordance with its own principles. In the years that followed the injury to his leg, something remarkable began to happen within the household of Epaphroditus. Epictetus, still legally a slave, still subject to the will and whims of his owner, began to teach. Not in any formal capacity, not in a lecture hall or a school, but in the quiet moments between tasks, in the slave quarters at night, in the brief intervals of rest that the daily routine of service allowed. He shared with his fellow slaves the ideas he had absorbed from Musonius Rufus, and he shared them not as abstract philosophical doctrines, but as practical tools for survival, ways of thinking about their condition that could preserve their dignity and their mental freedom in a world that denied them every other kind. The audience for these early teachings was small and select, consisting of other slaves in the household who had the inclination and the energy, after long days of labor, to sit and listen and think. These were people who, like Epictetus, had been denied education, denied opportunity, denied the basic respect that every human being deserves, and who had learned through hard experience that the world was not arranged in their favor. For them, the ideas that Epictetus presented were not intellectual curiosities. They were necessities, strategies for maintaining a sense of self, worth and inner peace in conditions that were designed to destroy both. The teaching was simple at first, because it had to be. These were not educated people. They had not studied rhetoric or logic, or the writings of the great philosophers. Many of them could not read. So Epictetus taught through stories, through analogies drawn from the daily life they all shared, through questions that probed and challenged and opened up new ways of seeing familiar things. He would ask them to consider a situation that had happened that day, something frustrating or humiliating or painful, and then he would guide them through an examination of it. What exactly happened? What did you feel? Was it the event itself that caused your suffering? Or was it the judgment you passed on the event? Could you have responded differently? What would that different response have looked like? These were the methods of Socratic dialogue, adapted for an audience of enslaved people in the back rooms of a Roman household, and they were extraordinarily effective. The slaves who listened to Epictetus began to change, not in any visible or external way, for their conditions remained what they were, but in their inner bearing, in the way they carried themselves and responded to the demands placed upon them. There are reports from this period that some of them developed a remarkable calm, a steadiness of demeanor that puzzled and even unsettled their masters, who were accustomed to the fear and subservience that slavery typically produced. The night sessions in the slave quarters would have had a quality of intimacy and urgency that no formal lecture hall could replicate. The room would have been small and close, lit by a single oil lamp that turned the walls into a canvas of flickering shadow. The voices would have been low, not only to avoid detection, but because the subjects they discussed touched on the most private and vulnerable parts of a person's experience. There was no audience to perform for, no reputation to maintain, no social hierarchy within that circle, because every person there shared the same condition. A cook and a porter and a manservant sat together in the dim light, and the man with the limp spoke to them, not as a philosopher addresses students, but as one wounded person speaks to others about the possibility of healing. The questions he asked them were questions he had asked himself in the long hours after his injury, alone with his pain and his growing understanding. The distinction between what is and is not within our power was not a theoretical proposition in that room. It was a matter of whether a person could get through the next day without being destroyed by it and this gave the teaching a vividness and an authenticity that no amount of scholarly refinement could have provided. For Epictetus himself, these years of informal teaching were a period of deepening understanding and growing confidence in the philosophy that was becoming his life's work. Each time he explained a concept to someone else, he understood it better himself. Each time he watched a fellow slave grasp the distinction between what is and is not within our power, he felt the truth of it more deeply. And each time he saw the practical benefits of the philosophy in the lives of people who had nothing else to sustain them. He became more certain that he was onto something universal, something that applied not only to slaves, but to every human being, regardless of their circumstances. The philosophy was taking root not as a system of abstract ideas, but as a living practice, a way of approaching each moment of each day with awareness and intention. Epictetus developed, during these years, the core principles that would later be recorded in the Discourses and the Enchiridion. He refined the concept of prohairesis, often translated as moral purpose or volitional choice, which he considered the most important thing in human life. Prohairesis, as Epictetus understood it, is the faculty that allows us to choose how we respond to any situation, and it is the one thing that no external force can control. A person can be imprisoned, tortured, enslaved, impoverished, or exiled, but no one can force them to assent to a false judgment or to desire something that is not truly good. He also developed, during this period, his distinctive teaching style, which was direct, provocative, and deeply personal. Epictetus did not lecture in the detached and theoretical manner of some philosophers. He spoke directly to his listeners, challenging them, sometimes sharply, to examine their own assumptions and to live in accordance with the truths they claimed to accept. If someone said that they understood the importance of not being attached to external things, Epictetus might ask them what they would do if their most prized possession were taken away. If someone claimed to be indifferent to public opinion, he might ask them how they felt when they were praised or criticized. His method was to expose the gap between what people say they believe and how they actually live, and to push them with patience but also with firmness toward closing that gap. This style of teaching, which could be uncomfortable and even unsettling, was rooted in a deep compassion for his listeners. Epictetus believed that most human suffering is unnecessary, that it arises not from the events of our lives, but from the judgments we pass on those events, and that by correcting our judgments, we can eliminate the greater part of our misery. To allow someone to continue suffering unnecessarily, when they could be free of that suffering through a change of mind, was, in his view, a failure of kindness. His sharpness was not cruelty, but urgency. The urgency of a person who has found something that can genuinely help people and who wants them to benefit from it before it is too late. The philosophy was also taking root in Epictetus's own character, shaping not only what he taught, but who he was becoming. The person who had entered the household of Epaphroditus as a frightened and powerless boy was emerging as a man of remarkable composure and inner authority. Those who encountered him noticed something unusual about his bearing, a stillness at the center of his personality that did not waver in response to the provocations and uncertainties of slave life. This stillness was not passivity. It was the visible expression of a disciplined mind that had learned to respond to each situation with deliberate judgment rather than automatic reaction. He was becoming, in the fullest sense, the thing his philosophy described, a person whose happiness depended on nothing external and whose peace could not be disturbed by any change of fortune. There was something almost paradoxical about this transformation, because the stillness that others observed in Epictetus was not the stillness of a person who had withdrawn from the world or who had ceased to care about what happened around him. He cared deeply about the welfare of his fellow slaves, and he cared about the truth of the ideas he was teaching. The stillness was something else entirely. It was the stillness of a person who had learned to hold his cares lightly, to pursue what was within his power without being shattered by what was not. He could advocate for a fellow slave who was being mistreated and accept the outcome, whatever it was, with the same equanimity. He could explain a concept with passion and precision and then return to scrubbing a floor without any sense of diminishment. This was not the stiffness of a person who had armored themselves against feeling. It was the fluidity of a person who had learned to feel fully without being controlled by what they felt. And this distinction between feeling and being ruled by feeling was one of the most important gifts he had to offer. The political situation in Rome shifted dramatically with the death of Nero in the year 60. 8 and the ensuing year of the 4 emperors, a period of civil war and rapid political transition that shook the Roman Empire to its foundations. In the space of barely more than a year, 4 different men claimed the imperial throne, and the violence and instability that accompanied these transitions affected every level of Roman society. For Epaphroditus, the shift was personally consequential, as he had been deeply implicated in the final days of Nero's reign, including, according to some accounts, assisting in the emperor's suicide. The new regime under Vespasian initially tolerated Epaphroditus, but the freedman's position was more precarious than it had been. For Epictetus, these political upheavals were not abstract events. They were the background against which his daily life unfolded, and they demonstrated with renewed force the truth of the philosophy he had been developing. Emperors rose and fell. Powerful men were executed or exiled. Fortunes that had seemed unassailable evaporated overnight. And through it all, the fundamental question remained the same: what can I control, and what must I accept? The instability of the political world was in a sense, the perfect confirmation of Stoic teaching, a constant reminder that external circumstances are unreliable and that the only stable foundation for a good life is internal. The real crisis came with the accession of Domitian to the imperial throne in the year 80. 1. Domitian was a ruler of a very different character from his father Vespasian and his brother Titus, both of whom had been relatively moderate and pragmatic in their exercise of power. Domitian was suspicious, autocratic, and increasingly paranoid as his reign progressed. He demanded to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, and he surrounded himself with flatterers while punishing any hint of independence or dissent with severity. It was under Domitian that the Roman government began a systematic campaign against philosophers, whom the emperor seems to have regarded as threats to his authority. In the year 80, 9 or 90, Domitian issued an edict expelling all philosophers from the city of Rome and from Italy itself. The reasons for this expulsion were complex, involving both the emperor's personal paranoia and a genuine tension between the philosophical ethos of independent thought and the imperial demand for unquestioning obedience. Philosophers, particularly Stoics, had a habit of speaking truth to power, of arguing that virtue was more important than wealth or political advancement, and of maintaining a loyalty to principle that could be interpreted, rightly or wrongly, as disloyalty to the emperor. Domitian, who saw potential conspirators everywhere, was not inclined to make fine distinctions between philosophical integrity and political sedition. The expulsion affected a large number of prominent thinkers. Musonius Rufus, Epictetus's beloved teacher, was among those banished. Other distinguished philosophers, including Epictetus's contemporaries in the Stoic and other schools, were forced to leave their homes, their students, and the city that had been the center of their intellectual lives. It was a traumatic event for the philosophical community, a demonstration that the freedom of thought they cherished was, in the practical world, contingent upon the tolerance of those who held physical power. The day the edict was announced would have begun like any other day in Rome, with the ordinary sounds of the city rising through the morning air, the clatter of carts on cobblestones, the calls of street vendors, the distant murmur of the crowd in the forum. But for the philosophers and their students, the day would have ended in a kind of quiet chaos. As the news spread from gathering to gathering and the implications sank in, there would have been hurried conversations in porticos and gardens, scrolls hastily gathered into bags, farewell embraces on street corners, the dawning realization that the life one had known was over and that a new and uncertain chapter was beginning. For Epictetus, who had spent years teaching others that everything external is subject to sudden and unpredictable change, the edict must have arrived with the weight of a final examination, a test of whether the philosophy he had preached could bear the weight of his own experience. He would have gathered his few possessions, perhaps a change of clothing, and a wax tablet on which he had recorded key passages from Musonius's lectures, and he would have prepared to leave the city that had been his home for decades. For Epictetus, the banishment presented both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge was obvious. He was being forced to leave Rome, the city where he had spent much of his adult life, the place where he had studied with Musonius and begun to develop his own teaching. He did not know where he would go or how he would support himself. He was, in addition to being a philosopher, still legally a slave, though the precise status of his enslavement at this point is unclear from the historical record. Some scholars believe that he had already been freed by this time, perhaps by Epictetus or by someone else, while others think that his formal emancipation came later. In either case, his position was precarious. But the opportunity inherent in the banishment was equally real, and it was an opportunity that Epictetus seems to have recognized immediately. To be expelled from Rome was, in one sense, to be liberated from Rome, freed from the constraints of a society that defined him by his legal status and his physical condition, and released into a wider world where he could define himself by his philosophy and his teaching. The Stoic response to exile was not grief or anger, but acceptance, and Epictetus, who had spent years cultivating this response in himself and others, now had the chance to demonstrate it on the largest possible scale. He left Rome, according to all accounts, calmly and without protest, treating the emperor's edict not as an injustice to be resisted, but as a circumstance to be accepted and worked with. The other philosophers who were expelled at the same time reacted in various ways. Some were bitter, some were frightened, some were bewildered by the sudden turn of events. But Epictetus, the former slave who had less to lose than any of them, seems to have been the most composed of all, because he had spent the longest time preparing for precisely this kind of upheaval. When you have already accepted that everything external can be taken from you at any moment, the actual taking of it comes as no surprise. The surprise, for those who watched him, was not that he endured the banishment, but that he seemed almost untroubled by it, as though Domitian had done him a favor rather than an injury. There is a profound irony in the fact that Domitian's banishment of the philosophers, intended to silence them and diminish their influence, actually had the opposite effect. By forcing Epictetus and his fellow thinkers out of Rome and into the broader Greek world, the emperor inadvertently spread their ideas to new audiences and gave them a freedom of operation that they had not enjoyed under the watchful eye of the imperial court. The philosophers who were expelled from Rome went to Athens, to Alexandria, to the cities of Asia Minor and the Greek mainland, and they took their teachings with them. The diaspora of philosophical thought that Domitian's edict created may have been one of the most consequential events in the history of ancient philosophy, and it was driven by a ruler who understood nothing of what he was setting in motion. The road out of Rome would have been crowded in those days, as other philosophers and their companions made their way south toward the ports. Their small processions of donkeys and pack animals winding through the suburban countryside past villas and tombs, and the occasional roadside shrine. Epictetus would have walked with his characteristic limp, moving at his own steady pace, perhaps alongside other exiles who marveled at his composure, or who simply found comfort in the presence of someone who seemed genuinely untroubled by what had happened. The city walls would have receded behind them, and the landscape would have opened into the rolling Campagna. The flat farmland that surrounded Rome for miles in every direction, dotted with farms and crossed by the great roads that connected the capital to the provinces. The air would have been cleaner here, free of the smoke and press of a million people, and the sky wider, and a person walking south toward the sea might have felt, for the first time in a long while, the particular kind of freedom that comes from being no longer enclosed by walls. Whether the walls of a household or the walls of a city that has decided it no longer wants you. The journey from Rome to Nicopolis would have taken Epictetus across the breadth of the Mediterranean world, by land through Italy to the port of Brundisium, and then by sea across the Adriatic to the western coast of Greece. It was a journey of several hundred miles through landscapes that shifted from the familiar Italian countryside to the wilder, more mountainous terrain of Epirus in northwestern Greece. For a man with a damaged leg, the journey would have been physically demanding, requiring long days of walking or riding, uncomfortable nights in roadside inns or under the open sky, and the constant uncertainty that attends any journey through unfamiliar territory. But Epictetus traveled, as he did everything, with the equanimity that his philosophy prescribed. The road was rough. It was not up to him, and so he accepted it. The weather was unpredictable. It was not up to him, and so he did not fret about it. The inns were uncomfortable. They were not up to him, and so he made the best of them. This does not mean that he felt no discomfort or experienced no inconvenience. It means that he did not add to the discomfort of the road the additional suffering of resentment, frustration, or the wish that things were otherwise than they were. He practiced, in other words, exactly what he taught, the disciplined acceptance of what is, combined with the focused attention to what is within his power, which in this case meant the quality of his own mind as he traveled. The sea crossing from Brundisium to the coast of Epirus was a passage that many travelers in the ancient world approached with apprehension. The Adriatic was known for its sudden storms and its unpredictable winds, and a crossing that should have taken a day or two could stretch to a week or more if the weather turned unfavorable. Epictetus would have boarded a small merchant vessel or a coastal trader, sharing the limited space below deck with other passengers and cargo, enduring the motion of the waves, and the close quarters of ancient sea travel. For a philosopher who had taught that we should not be attached to the outcomes of our journeys, but should focus instead on the quality of our sailing, this was another opportunity to practice what he preached. The experience of being at sea in the ancient world was one that stripped away many of the illusions of control that people cling to in their daily lives on land. On a small vessel in the middle of the Adriatic, the traveler was at the mercy of wind and wave, of the skill of the captain and the condition of the hull, of forces that were entirely beyond their influence and that could, without warning, transform a routine crossing into a struggle for survival. Epictetus would have felt the roll of the deck beneath his feet, the salt spray on his face, the pitching and yawing of the timbers as the ship worked its way through swells that rose and fell with a rhythm that no human will could alter. He would have shared the cramped space below deck with other travelers, smelling the odors of tar and wet wool, and the bodies of people who had not washed in days. And in that space of vulnerability and discomfort, he would have practiced the fundamental exercise of his philosophy, examining each impression as it arose, the fear when the waves grew larger, the irritation when the voyage was delayed, the longing for solid ground, and choosing, in each case, whether to assent to the impression or to hold it at a distance and regard it with the calm attention of a philosopher who understands that the sea does not care about human wishes. The coast of Epirus, when it finally came into view, would have been a welcome sight. The land rises steeply from the sea, a rugged coastline of white limestone and dark vegetation, with small harbors tucked into coves and inlets where fishing boats sheltered from the open water. The air smelled of salt and wild herbs, and the light had a clarity and a brilliance that was different from the softer, more humid atmosphere of Rome. This was Greece, the land where philosophy had been born 5 centuries earlier, and even in its diminished state under Roman rule, it retained a cultural and intellectual vitality that Rome, for all its power, could not match. Nicopolis, the city that would become Epictetus's home for the rest of his life, lay a short distance inland from the coast of Epirus. It had been founded by Octavian, later the Emperor Augustus, to commemorate his victory over Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 30, one before the Common Era. The name means City of Victory, and the city had been built on a grand scale, with temples, theaters, gymnasia, and aqueducts that rivaled those of any city in the Greek world. By Epictetus's time, Nicopolis was no longer the gleaming new capital that Augustus had envisioned, but it remained a substantial and cultured city, home to a mixed population of Greeks, Romans, and peoples from across the eastern Mediterranean. The choice of Nicopolis as his destination was not random. The city had several features that made it attractive to a philosopher in Epictetus's position. It was far enough from Rome to be beyond the effective reach of Domitian's edict, yet connected enough to the broader Roman world to attract students and visitors. It had a strong Greek cultural identity, which meant that philosophy was valued and respected in a way that was not always the case in the more pragmatic Roman West. And it was situated in a landscape of extraordinary natural beauty, with the Ionian Sea to the west and the mountains of Epirus to the east, a setting that harmonized with the Stoic appreciation for the natural world as a source of wisdom and tranquility. When Epictetus arrived in Nicopolis, he would have found a city that was, in many ways, an ideal place to begin a new chapter of his life. The physical infrastructure of the Augustan foundation was still largely intact, providing ample spaces for public discourse and philosophical teaching. The city's gymnasia and public buildings offered venues where a teacher could gather students and hold discussions. The harbor provided a connection to the wider world, ensuring a steady flow of visitors and potential students from across the Mediterranean. And the surrounding countryside, with its olive groves and its views of the sea, offered the kind of quiet, contemplative environment in which philosophy has always flourished best. The first days in Nicopolis would have been filled with the small practicalities of resettlement, finding a place to sleep, locating sources of food and water, learning the layout of streets and public spaces that were unfamiliar, but that would, in time, become as familiar as the corridors of Epictetus's household had once been. The city would have been quieter than Rome, its pace slower, its sounds different. The clang of a shepherd's bell replacing the clatter of the Roman Forum, the cry of seabirds replacing the shouts of vendors. For a man who had spent decades in the noise and pressure of the imperial capital, this quiet would have been both disorienting and deeply restorative. And beneath the surface of these practical adjustments, something more significant was happening. Epictetus was, for the first time in his life, living in a place where no one knew him as a slave. In Nicopolis, he was simply the philosopher from Rome, a man with a limp and a remarkable mind. And the freedom of this anonymity, the freedom to be defined by what he thought, rather than by what he was legally, must have been a kind of liberation that went beyond anything the Edict of Domitian had intended. For a man who had been expelled from the greatest city in the world, who had lost his home and his community, and everything familiar to him, the arrival in Nicopolis must have been both an ending and a beginning. The ending was the life he had known in Rome, the household of Epictetus, the lectures of Musonius, the small circle of slave students to whom he had first taught the principles that now defined his existence. The beginning was everything that lay ahead, the school he would establish, the students he would teach, the words that would be written down and preserved for 2,000 years and counting. He could not have known, as he limped through the gates of Nicopolis for the first time, what the future held. But he could have known, because his philosophy told him so, that the future was not his to worry about, and that the only thing that mattered was the quality of his own mind in the present moment. The past, with all its suffering, was over. The future, with all its uncertainty, had not arrived. What remained was this moment, this step, this breath, and the choice to meet it with clarity and grace. This was the philosophy in its purest form. Not a set of ideas to be discussed, but a way of walking through the world, one deliberate step at a time. In Nicopolis, Epictetus established the school that would make him one of the most influential teachers of the ancient world. He did not found an institution in the formal sense, with buildings and endowments and an official curriculum. Instead, he created a community of learning, a circle of students who gathered around him to hear his lectures, to engage in dialogue, and to practice the discipline of philosophy as a way of life. The school was, in essence, Epictetus himself, his mind, his character, his example. And the students were those who recognized in him something worth traveling across the Mediterranean to be near. The teaching took place in various locations around the city. Sometimes Epictetus lectured in a public hall or a colonnaded space where passers-by could stop and listen. Sometimes he held discussions in the gymnasia, where the physical training of the body was accompanied, in his case, by the training of the mind. And sometimes he taught in more private settings, in the homes of wealthy students, or in the garden of whatever modest dwelling he occupied. The informality of these arrangements was entirely in keeping with his philosophy, which held that philosophy was not a matter of formal schooling, but of daily practice, and that the proper classroom was not a building, but the world itself, with all its challenges and opportunities. The students who came to Nicopolis to study with Epictetus were drawn from a remarkably wide range of backgrounds. Some were wealthy young Romans, seeking to round out their education with a period of philosophical study, a common practice among the Roman elite. Some were Greeks from prominent families who saw in Epictetus's teaching a continuation of the great philosophical tradition that their ancestors had pioneered. Some were older men who had experienced the ups and downs of public life and were looking for a philosophy that could help them make sense of their experiences. And some, remarkably, were fellow former slaves or people of humble origin who saw in Epictetus a model of what was possible for a person who started with nothing. Among the students who passed through the school at Nicopolis, several went on to positions of considerable influence. The most notable was a young man named Ionian, who would later become a distinguished historian, a Roman senator, and the governor of Cappadocia. It was Ionian who would eventually write down the teachings of Epictetus, preserving them in the works known as the Discourses and the Enchiridion, and without his efforts, the words of Epictetus might have been lost entirely. Another student, or at least a person deeply influenced by Epictetus's teaching, was Marcus Cornelius Fronto, a rhetorician who would later become the tutor of the future Emperor Marcus Aurelius. In this way, the teaching of the former slave flowed into the mind of the most powerful man in the world, a chain of influence that is one of the most remarkable in the history of ideas. The presence of Arrian in the school must have added a particular dimension to the teaching, because here was a student who possessed not only intelligence and commitment, but the literary skill to preserve what he was hearing for future generations. Arrian would have sat among the other students with his wax tablet and stylus, capturing the words of Epictetus with the care of a person who understood that what was being said in this small Greek city was important enough to be written down and kept. The other students would have known that their discussions were being recorded, and this awareness may have added both a seriousness and a certain self-consciousness to their exchanges. But for Epictetus himself, the presence of the scribe probably changed very little, because he did not teach for the sake of posterity. He taught for the person sitting in front of him, for the confused young man who needed clarity, for the grieving older man who needed perspective, for the slave or the freedman who needed to know that freedom was possible even now. The fact that his words would survive was, from his perspective, not up to him, and therefore not something to dwell upon. The daily routine of the school reflected Epictetus's belief that philosophy was a practice, not a body of knowledge to be acquired and then set aside. A typical day might begin with a lecture or a set piece of teaching, in which Epictetus would present a concept or work through a problem, using examples and arguments to bring his listeners to a clearer understanding. This would be followed by a period of dialogue in which students asked questions, raised objections, and explored the implications of what had been presented. The dialogue was often vigorous and sometimes sharp, as Epictetus did not hesitate to challenge students who he felt were being lazy in their thinking or dishonest in their self-examination. But the teaching extended beyond the formal sessions of lecture and discussion. Epictetus expected his students to apply the philosophy to every aspect of their daily lives. He gave them exercises and practices designed to strengthen their capacity for judgment and self-control. He might ask a student to practice going without a particular pleasure for a set period, not because the pleasure was bad in itself, but because the exercise of choosing to forego it strengthened the faculty of volition. He might instruct them to reflect at the end of each day on where their judgments had been sound and where they had allowed themselves to be carried away by impressions that were not examined. He might encourage them to think carefully about their desires and aversions, to distinguish between those that were natural and appropriate, and those that were imposed by social convention or irrational fear. The physical setting of the school contributed to its character. Nicopolis, with its views of the Ionian Sea and its proximity to the mountains of Epirus, offered a landscape that naturally invited contemplation. The sea, in particular, was a constant presence, its rhythms of tide and weather providing a daily reminder of the larger forces that govern the world and the smallness of human concerns within that vast context. Students who walked along the coast or sat on the hills overlooking the water would have found it easy to step back from their personal preoccupations and to see their lives in a broader perspective. And this stepping back was one of the essential practices of Stoic philosophy. The school at Nicopolis also had a rhythm that reflected the natural world around it. Teaching followed the patterns of the seasons, the weather, and the agricultural calendar of the region. There were days of intense study and days of quieter reflection, periods when many students were present, and periods when the circle was small and intimate. Epictetus did not impose a rigid schedule or a formal curriculum. He taught when the occasion demanded it, responded to the questions his students brought to him, and allowed the philosophy to unfold organically in the context of lived experience. This approach was entirely consistent with his belief that philosophy is not a subject to be mastered, but a way of life to be practiced, and that the proper teacher is not one who transmits information, but one who models the kind of attention and judgment that lead to wisdom. Epictetus himself lived simply in Nicopolis in a manner consistent with his teachings about the unimportance of material possessions. He owned very little, perhaps no more than a few garments, a lamp, and the clay utensils needed for simple meals. He did not marry, or at least there is no record of a wife or children, and he seems to have devoted himself entirely to his teaching. His famous limp, the permanent reminder of the cruelty he had suffered under Epictetus, would have been a daily sight for his students, a living testament to the philosophy of inner freedom that he taught. When they saw him limping through the colonnades, climbing the steps to the lecture hall, or walking along the coastal path, they saw a man whose body bore the marks of oppression, and whose mind was entirely free. In the evenings, when the teaching was done, and the students had dispersed to their lodgings, Epictetus would have been alone with the sound of the sea and the slow rotation of the stars above Nicopolis. These quiet hours, which the historical records do not describe, but which we can imagine with some confidence, would have been the time when the philosopher who had given so much of himself to others turned his attention inward, examining his own mind with the same rigor he demanded of his students. He would have lit his small clay lamp, perhaps prepared a simple meal of bread and olive oil, and sat in the doorway of his dwelling, looking out at the darkness. The questions he had asked his students during the day, the challenges he had posed, the deficiencies he had identified in their thinking, would have echoed in his own reflection, because Epictetus was not a teacher who exempted himself from the discipline he prescribed. The lamp would have burned low. The sea would have murmured in the distance. And the former slave who had found his freedom would have practiced it once more in the silence of a Greek night, as he had practiced it every day since the day he first understood that the mind is the only thing that cannot be taken away. The words of Epictetus have come down to us primarily through the work of his student Ionian, who attended the lectures at Nicopolis and took careful notes on what his teacher said. Ionian was a man of considerable ability and reputation in his own right. He would go on to write the Anabasis, an account of the campaigns of Alexander the Great that is still read today, and he served with distinction as a Roman general and administrator. But it is his work as the amanuensis of Epictetus that has secured his most enduring legacy. For without Ionian's faithful transcriptions, the voice of the former slave would have been lost to history. Ionian compiled his notes into two works. The larger work, known as the Discourses, consisted of 4 books of recorded lectures and discussions, though only 4 of the original 8 books have survived. The smaller work, the Enchiridion or Handbook, was a concise summary of the most important principles of Epictetus's teaching, designed to be carried and consulted as a practical guide to daily living. Together, these works provide a remarkably vivid picture of Epictetus as a teacher and as a thinker, preserving not only the content of his ideas, but the texture and energy of his delivery. The Discourses are not polished treatises, but live records of teaching sessions, complete with questions from students, digressions, and the occasional flash of impatience or humor. Reading them, you can almost hear Epictetus speaking. His voice comes through clearly direct, unsentimental, sometimes harsh, always urgent. He addresses his students as if their very lives depend on what he is telling them, because he believes that they do. He is not interested in theoretical elegance or rhetorical display. He wants to change the way his listeners think and live, and every word is aimed at that practical goal. The central teaching that runs through all of the discourses is the concept of the dichotomy of control, the distinction between what is up to us and what is not. This distinction, which Epictetus considered the foundation of all philosophical progress, is stated with remarkable clarity at the very beginning of the Enchiridion. Some things are up to us, and some are not up to us. Our opinions, impulses, desires, and aversions are up to us. Our bodies, possessions, reputations, and public offices are not. The things that are up to us are by nature free, unhindered, and unobstructed. The things that are not up to us are weak, servile, subject to hindrance, and not our own. This distinction, simple as it sounds, contains within it the entire structure of Epictetus's ethical philosophy. If we truly understand and internalize the difference between what we can and cannot control, he teaches, we will cease to be troubled by most of the things that cause human suffering. We will not be distressed by the loss of possessions because we never truly possessed them. We will not be disturbed by the opinions of others because their opinions are not within our power. We will not be paralyzed by fear of the future because the future has not happened and is therefore not within our control. And we will not be consumed by regret for the past, because the past is over and cannot be changed. What remains, when all the things that are not up to us have been set aside, is the one thing that is truly ours, our faculty of choice, our prohairesis, the inner capacity to judge, to desire, to intend, and to respond. This faculty is, for Epictetus, the essence of what it means to be human. It is the thing that separates us from the animals who act on instinct and impulse, and it is the thing that makes moral life possible. To care for this faculty, to train it, to strengthen it, to use it wisely and well, is the primary task of human existence. Everything else is secondary. Epictetus developed this teaching through a series of vivid metaphors and practical examples that made it accessible to his students. He compared a person who is upset by events beyond their control to a traveler who is angry at the rain. The rain does not care about your anger. It will fall regardless. What you can control is whether you carry an umbrella and whether you choose to let the rain spoil your journey. He compared someone who is anxious about public opinion to an actor who worries about whether the audience will applaud. The actor's job is to perform well, not to control the audience's response. If the performance is good, the actor has done what is within their power, and the rest is not their concern. These metaphors, drawn from the ordinary experiences of daily life, were part of what made Epictetus's teaching so effective. He did not ask his students to grasp abstract philosophical concepts. He asked them to look at their own lives, to examine their own reactions, and to see for themselves whether the philosophy was true. The proof of Stoicism for Epictetus was not in logical argument, but in lived experience. If you practice the distinction between what is and is not up to you, you will find that it works. You will find that your suffering diminishes, that your calm increases, and that you are better able to meet whatever life brings with grace and resilience. The students who heard these metaphors would have carried them out of the lecture hall and into the streets of Nicopolis, and from there into whatever lives they went on to live in the wider world. A young Roman who had heard the story of the traveler angry at the rain would, years later, standing in the rain outside a military encampment on the northern frontier, remember the story and smile at himself and let the rain fall. A merchant who had heard the comparison of public opinion to an audience's applause would, when his latest venture was praised or mocked in the marketplace, feel the old impulse to be swayed by the voices, and then, at the last moment, pull back and remember what the teacher in Nicopolis had said. These metaphors functioned as mental tools, compact and portable, ready to be deployed at the moment of need, and their simplicity was not a sign of superficiality, but of the deep practicality that was the hallmark of Epictetus's entire approach to philosophy. The discourses also reveal Epictetus's deep concern with the proper use of impressions, the way we interpret the raw data of sensory experience. Every time we perceive something, he taught, we receive an impression, and before we act on that impression, we have a moment of choice in which we can examine it and decide whether it is true, whether it is important, and whether it requires a response. Most people, he argued, skip this examination and react automatically to their impressions, allowing themselves to be carried away by appearances. The philosopher, by contrast, pauses, examines, and chooses, and this deliberate and reflective response is what distinguishes a life of wisdom from a life of confusion. This teaching on impressions was perhaps the most refined and technically precise aspect of Epictetus's philosophy, and it reflected decades of practice and observation. He had watched his own mind at work through years of suffering and had learned to identify the exact point at which an impression becomes a judgment, and a judgment becomes an emotion, and an emotion becomes an action. He understood that this sequence happens with extraordinary speed, so fast that most people are not even aware of the intermediate steps and experience the whole chain as a single, overwhelming event. The task of philosophy, as Epictetus conceived it, was to slow this process down, to insert a gap between impression and response, and to use that gap for the examination that transforms automatic reaction into deliberate choice. In the hands of a master practitioner, this gap could become a space of genuine freedom, a moment in which the person is no longer driven by external events, but is instead guiding their own responses with awareness and intention. The influence of these teachings continued to grow long after the lectures themselves had ended. Arrian's transcriptions circulated among the educated classes of the Roman Empire, and the Enchiridion, with its concise and practical format, became one of the most widely read philosophical works of antiquity. The ideas that Epictetus had developed in the slave quarters of Rome and refined in the lecture halls of Nicopolis were reaching audiences that he could never have imagined. Audiences that included senators, generals, and eventually emperors. The former slave, who had once been forbidden even to attend lectures, had become one of the most widely read authors in the ancient world. And his words were shaping the minds of the people who governed it. In the later years of his life in Nicopolis, Epictetus continued to teach with the same energy and dedication that had characterized his work from the beginning. The school attracted students from across the Roman world, and his reputation as a philosopher of extraordinary depth and practical wisdom continued to grow. But the teaching itself did not change in its fundamentals. Epictetus was not a philosopher who constantly revised his ideas or pursued new theoretical frameworks. He had found, early in his life, the core truth that would sustain him through everything, and he spent the remaining decades refining and deepening his understanding of that truth, not replacing it with something new. The concept that came to dominate his later teaching was that of the inner citadel, the idea that each person carries within themselves a fortress of the mind that no external force can breach. This citadel is not built of stone or defended by armies. It is constructed from the disciplined faculty of judgment, the trained capacity to examine impressions and to choose responses wisely. When this inner citadel is strong, a person can face any external circumstance without being overwhelmed by it. They can endure poverty, illness, exile, and even death. Not because these things are not painful, but because the pain does not penetrate to the core of who they are. The image of the citadel was particularly powerful coming from a man who had spent his early life, in the most literal sense, without a fortress of any kind. As a slave, Epictetus had had no home of his own, no walls to retreat behind, no doors to close against the world. His vulnerability was total and absolute. And it was precisely this total vulnerability that had forced him to discover the only kind of fortress that truly matters, the fortress of the mind. He knew from the most direct possible experience that every external refuge can be taken away, a house can be seized, a body can be broken, a reputation can be destroyed, but the faculty of choice, the prohairesis, the inner capacity to judge and respond, and to determine one's own character, this cannot be taken by any force, because it is not a thing that exists in the external world. It is the very essence of the person, and it is inviolable. This teaching, which Epictetus presented with the authority of a life that had tested it under the most extreme conditions, has resonated across the centuries because it speaks to a universal human need. Everyone, regardless of their circumstances, has experienced the vulnerability of being subject to forces beyond their control. Everyone has felt the anxiety of not knowing what the future holds, the grief of losing something or someone they loved, the frustration of being unable to make the world conform to their wishes. And everyone has wondered, in their darker moments, whether there is any foundation for happiness that does not depend on the cooperation of external events. Epictetus's answer, refined through decades of teaching and reflection, was that there is such a foundation, and it lies within. In the long arc of Epictetus's life, from the thermal springs of Phrygia to the colonnades of Nicopolis, the journey was not one of accumulating possessions or status or any of the things that most people spend their lives pursuing. It was a journey inward, a progressive discovery of the territory of the mind, and in his later years that territory had become as familiar to him as the streets of his childhood had been to other men. He knew its paths and its pitfalls, its open clearings where understanding was easy, and its dense thickets where confusion still lurked. He knew that the citadel was not a place you reached once and then occupied forever, but a place you had to return to every day through practice and attention and the willingness to begin again each morning. The old man with the limp who climbed the steps to the lecture hall in Nicopolis was not performing a role or maintaining an appearance. He was simply living as he had always lived, in accordance with the deepest truth he had found, and the simplicity of this life, its freedom from pretension and ambition, was itself a kind of teaching more eloquent than any words. The students who came to Nicopolis in the later years of Epictetus's life found a teacher who had mellowed somewhat in his manner, but not in his message. He remained direct and uncompromising in his demand that philosophy be lived, not merely studied. He continued to challenge his students to push them toward greater honesty and greater self-examination. But there was also, in these later years, a quality of gentleness that had perhaps always been present, but that became more visible as the urgency of his earlier years gave way to a quieter confidence in the truth of what he taught. He knew by this point that the philosophy worked. He had seen it transform the lives of hundreds of students. He had lived it himself through suffering and loss and exile. And he knew that it would endure long after he was gone, because it was rooted not in the particular circumstances of his own life, but in the permanent structure of human nature, a structure that does not change with the centuries, or the empires that rise and fall across the surface of the earth. The legacy of Epictetus is difficult to overstate. Through the work of Ionian, his teachings were preserved and transmitted to later generations, where they influenced an extraordinary range of thinkers and movements. The early Christian fathers found much in Epictetus that resonated with their own ethical teachings, and some scholars have argued that certain passages in the New Testament reflect a familiarity with Stoic ideas that may have been mediated through Epictetus or his students. The philosopher Marcus Aurelius, who became emperor of Rome in the 2nd century, was deeply influenced by the teaching of Epictetus, and his Meditations, one of the great works of philosophy, contains echoes of Epictetus's central ideas on nearly every page. In later centuries, the thought of Epictetus influenced figures as diverse as Montaigne, Spinoza, and the modern cognitive behavioral therapists, who have recognized in his teaching a precursor of their own methods. But the most remarkable aspect of Epictetus's legacy is not the fame of those he influenced, but the simplicity and accessibility of what he taught. He did not found a school of philosophy in the technical sense. He did not write systematic treatises or develop a complex metaphysical system. He simply taught, with extraordinary clarity and force, that the key to a good life is to focus our attention and our effort on what is within our control, and to accept with equanimity what is not. And he taught this not as a consolation for the weak, but as a profound truth about the nature of human agency, a truth that applies with equal force to emperors and slaves, to the powerful and the powerless, to every person who has ever drawn breath and wondered whether their life has meaning and purpose. This teaching does not require advanced education or philosophical training to understand. It requires only the willingness to examine one's own mind and the courage to change the way one thinks and lives. It is, in this sense, the most democratic of philosophies, available to anyone, regardless of their station in life, and this was entirely appropriate for a man who had begun that life as a slave. The circumstances of Epictetus's death are not recorded, and this absence is, in its own way, fitting. A philosopher who spent his life teaching that the only things that matter are the things within our control would not have wanted his final moments to become a subject of morbid curiosity or sentimental legend. He would have wanted his students to remember not how he died, but how he lived. Not the end of his story, but the principles that gave it meaning. The school at Nicopolis continued after his death, carried forward by students who had absorbed not only his ideas, but something of his character. The lamp that had burned in his simple dwelling was extinguished, but the light it had cast, the light of a mind that had found its freedom in the most unpromising circumstances imaginable, continued to burn in the pages of the discourses and the Enchiridion, and in the minds of everyone who has ever read them and felt the strange and consoling recognition that the words of a slave from Phrygia were addressed across the centuries to them. The night is deep now. The ancient world sleeps. The hills of Phrygia rest under their blanket of stars. The thermal springs still steam in the darkness. The marble of Rome's great buildings holds the cool of evening. The Ionian Sea breathes its slow rhythm against the shore. Everything that happened has happened. Everything that was said has been said. The boy was born. The man was broken. The philosopher rose. And through it all, something remained untouched, unbroken, free. Think of that something now, not as a philosophical idea, not as a concept from an ancient text. Think of it as a place inside yourself, a quiet room, a still center, the part of you that watches and waits and does not flinch. That part was there before you fell asleep tonight. It will be there when you wake. Nothing that happens in the hours between can reach it. The body rests. The mind settles. The breath moves in. The breath moves out. There is nothing to do now. Nothing to figure out. Nothing to fix. The day is done. The story is told. And the silence that remains is not empty. It is full of everything that matters. Epictetus knew this silence. He found it in the slave quarters of Rome. He found it in the pain of a broken leg. He found it on the road to exile. He found it in the lectures he gave to people who had come halfway across the world to hear him. And he found it here, in this quiet place inside, where no emperor can reach and no circumstance can touch. You do not need to be a philosopher to find this place. You do not need to have suffered greatly or traveled far. The place is here. It has always been here. It is the part of you that breathes without being told. The part that watches your thoughts without being consumed by them. The part that knows, in the deepest and quietest way, that you are whole, that you are enough, that you are free. Epictetus found it. A slave found it. A man with a broken leg found it. A man exiled from his home found it. And if they could find it, so can you. Not by searching harder, not by grasping more tightly, but by letting go, by releasing the things you cannot hold, and sinking into the stillness that has been there all along, waiting for you to notice it. Let the story go now. Let the words dissolve. Let the images fade. There is nothing more to hold on to. The philosophy has done its work, not by giving you something new, but by reminding you of something old, something you have always known, something that was there before you learned to worry, and will be there long after you forget. How? The sea is calm tonight. The stars are bright. The ancient stones are cool. Somewhere in the darkness, an oil lamp still burns. Its flame is small, but it has been burning for 2,000 years, and it will not go out. Rest now. Let go. Sink deeper. The story of Epictetus is not a story about a man who conquered the world. It is a story about a man who discovered that conquering the world was never necessary. Freedom was inside him all along, and it is inside you. It has always been inside you, and nothing in this world or any other can take it away. Sleep well, sleep deeply, sleep freely.